Welcome back to the Koreana podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and this, of course, is our literature series, which will run until the end of the summer, and will focus exclusively on Korean literature. And of course, it's through this lens that we have today's guest on the podcast, who is Janet Lee. Janet is an assistant professor of Korean literature at Keimyung University, and her work specializes on a look at the Chosŏn dynasty, the emotion, the gender, the change in the development, and the narratives that explode at this time in early Korean history. And of course, a central part of the literature of this period, and something that has sustained today and still remains inside contemporary Korean society and literature, and indeed popular culture, is the tale of Chunhyang. This is a story that easily translates to the ears of many people outside of Korean culture. It's that of a young woman who grows up within a hierarchical society in which she finds herself close to the bottom. But of course, the stratification comes quickly into view when a young man falls in love with her. It is that kind of romance, this star-crossed idea. It has a lot of Romeo and Juliet about it, but it also has a very serious undercurrent below all the romance. It is an attack on the social stratification of Chosun Korea. This is a young woman who marries above her status and then is drawn lovesick by the separation which is forced upon them. The story itself is something that I think is best that I'll let Janet Lee explain for herself, and of course which we're going to look at in very close detail throughout this podcast. But what makes this particular part of Janet's research so important is how she looks at the story and the contrast and lenses in which English audiences are now understanding it. And that is often through the work of two famous Western missionaries who arrived in Korea and translated and then exported works out to the broad audience. This is Horace Allen and James Gale. And of course, they didn't just translate the work if that was ever possible. They imposed a lot upon it. They translated it through the lens of their own ideals, their own look and understanding of the gendered nature of Korean society at the time. They altered parts of the story to make it more appealing and more easily understandable to a Western audience. But they also, in certain areas, imposed Christian elements, again changing the story from its original context, what it originally was, into something very different when it gets to Western eyes and ears. And it's this fascinating look that Janet is going to offer us here. Not just the story itself, not just an analysis of the details and what happens within the story and why it is so important and so potentially subversive at the time, but also exactly what these two missionaries were doing through their translation. Their slip-ups, their mistakes, and their deliberate changes of the text, altering it from its original context. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. We've made a conscious decision here in the Koreana podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do enjoy the podcast and you do want it to continue, please consider supporting us directly at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media, and all the help in that regard really is appreciated. On that, and to talk us through the tale of Chunhyang as translated by Western missionaries, this is Janet Lee. Janet Lee, welcome to the Koreana podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to be speaking about translation in some ways, but translation of a very famous Korean tale, the tale of Chunhyang. And I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, of course. But before we do start, I might get to introduce yourself a little bit and why you personally were attracted to this tale and why it's so important.
Sure. I'm teaching Korean language and literature, especially the pre-modern literature or gender-related courses as well at the Keimyung University located in Daegu, South Korea. And my official title is Assistant Professor of Department of Korean Language and Literature. In terms of the research, I've been kind of focusing on the women's literature, recently on the Women's Encyclopedia in Joseon Korea, the Joseon period from 1392 to 1910. But my first research topic is not about the women's literature. It's more about the martial tales. This gundam soseol is pretty much a very popular genre in Joseon Korea. And the story is centers on the male hero who kind of hone in the martial skills and find love with a woman and became very successful in the battles. But there I noticed that martial tales are always intertwined with many different elements, including the romance. So looks like my trajectory of research began with the martial stories, but also that covers love tales. So I began to write about love tales in the 17th century, usually written by the Joseon male literati. Then about 2016, I was invited to the conference or colloquium at the George Washington University. and they're actually planning a conference about the translation practice around this text of Tale of Chunhyang. So after that, then I discover what would be the first translation of Chunhyang in Korean, in English. So that's kind of the first time reading it. Although I major in Korean literature for many years, I just kind of believe that, I know that story. It's kind of typical Cinderella story. But when I actually read it, and I compare these two translations by the Western missionaries, I found so many different kind of elements play around in this text too. So, so I kind of intrigued to it, and I decided to write about it too.
So let's build on that intrigue then. This is such an interesting story to look at, but not just, as you mentioned, not just the story itself, but the eyes of the people that saw it and translated it and changed it fundamentally. So before we get into all the wonderful detail, just very briefly, what is the story? And this being said, with an expectation that when we get deeper into the podcast, there will be different sides of the story and a lot more detail coming out. So in brief, what is the story, just to give people an understanding of where we're heading here?
Okay. So people just call it Chunhyang, but they have a very different type of names as well. Like some people, 열려 Chunhyang Sturga, kind of song of faithful life, Chunhyang, and depending on the version. But basic storyline is like there is the Yangban, the son of Yangban. He was Lee Mong-yong. He came down to the Namwon County, accompanying his father, and he just found this woman on the swing, and she was like a Chunhyang. So he kind of falls in love with at first sight, and they kind of then their kind of relationship develop, and they exchange the promise of love. But love story is not as kind of I also they encounter many different types of conflicts too. That he have to left for Seoul because his father is transferred back to the capital, and the Chunhyang was left alone in Namwon area. But about the time, new magistrate, the Pyeonhakdo, actually came into the Namwon, and he actually was fascinated by the Chunhyang's beauty. So he actually wanted Chunhyang to serve him, but the Chunhyang actually claimed herself that, I actually made a promise with Lee Mong-yong, so I cannot serve you. So she actually, because of that, she was tortured, and eventually she was imprisoned. But it looks like the story is a happy ending because the Lee Mong-yong, as he came back to Namwon, he actually passed the civil service examination, 과거 시험. Then he became the secret royal inspector, so-called 암행어사. So after he returns to Namwon, he actually he pretends to be kind of nobody, he dressed like a beggar. He kind of attends the Pyeonhakdo, the magistrate's birthday party. And there, he kind of revealed his true identity as kind of royal inspector, and he recites a poem pretty much critical to Pyeon's kind of unlawful treatments or unlawful things. So there, then he kind of, after revealing his identity, he actually rescued the heroine, the Chunhyang. So then the story ends with their reunion, and briefly mentioned that they married and they lived happily after.
And why is this story so important in Korean literary tradition? It's, as you mentioned here, it's translated by early missionaries. So when these early missionaries arrive and they're trying to expand Korean culture and send it abroad, this is one of the stories that they jump on, of course. But it's more than that as well. This story seems to have really captured the minds. It survived over all these years. So why is this story so important in the literary tradition of Korea, and why was it so appealing to missionaries?
Yeah, definitely this story was pretty much popular in the late Joseon period, I think. And the story is not only a written text, it's kind of orally transmitted and be sung by the pansori singers. So there are many different, I think some audience enjoy the text as a reading, and some other people actually enjoy more like oral version, like a singing or a pansori version. And when it comes to about early 20th century, the Chunhyang became a very a high symbolism or kind of a representation, a representative of the Korean culture. So kind of people many believe or project this idea or nationalist ideas, oh, Chunhyang is a kind of essence of the Korean culture. And although the story is a very attractive too, as it's kind of like a Cinderella story, but there is many different political implication as well, because Chunhyang it belongs to depending the version, in kind of a Seoul edition version like Gyeongpanbon, it's kind of water block the edition. There, she kind of portrayed as kind of female entertainer, Keimyung or Kiseng. And her marriage above her social position, because she actually eventually married Lee Mong-yong, is kind of interpreted as kind of challenge to the social status system or as challenge to the cultural norms. At the same time, she actually wanted to proclaim herself as, I am the virtuous woman, so I cannot serve Pyeonakdo, the magistrate in the town. So because of that, this story also conforms to the Confucian norms. So there are very different, delicate layers of interpretation in the text. That actually entices many readers into this text as well.
And let's talk about what you mentioned there, the difference between like a Seoul version of this book, of this tale and other versions. There is an issue here of translation. And that's what we're going to look at just after this next question, the idea of translation and how these people changed it. So just as a first question there, what are the origins of this story? How many translations are there? How difficult is it? How varied are the translations? So what is the, what are the origins of this story and the different translations out there and the difficulty in finding a one specific story and one specific translation?
Okay. There's scores of editions about the Chunhyang, I think. And also, I mentioned in my article that maybe the oldest version of the tale would be the Chinese poems written by Eugene Han. We have two characters, and these poems deal with the love relationship between these characters. So that could be kind of served as a prototype of the tale. But looks like the Chunhyang is also constructed upon many different type of sources as well, because there are many kind of orally transmitted stories and folk tales or some motifs we can find in the folk narrative genre as well. But later on, as the story became popular and it was kind of placed in the market in a form of this published edition, like a Panggakbon. And in the Panggakbon, we have a three kind of printing service area during the Joseon period when it comes to 18th to 19th century. The first center was a capital, Seoul, and the other was Anseong. Gyeonggi-do is kind of pretty close to Seoul as well. Then another very famous city for the printing would have been Namwon. It's Jeonju. So it looks like when you define these editions of Chunhyang, we have three different type of the editions coming from the three different cities. But the Anseongbon is pretty much close to the Seoul edition. So people usually draw the comparison between the Gyeongpanbon, the Seoul edition, and the Jeonju, the Wanpanbon. And when you compare these two versions, Gyeongpanbon is much more we can see more like a male-centered view, because Chunhyang is just a female entertainer. And pretty much of the narrative is deal with how the male protagonist falls in love with a woman and how he passed the examination and how he became very successful, the governor as well. Well, when you compare the Seoul edition with the Jeonju edition emphasized, Chunhyang is not just female entertainer. She's actually, her father was the old magistrate in Namwon. So she has kind of this Yangban origin. So they kind of Wanpanbon or Jeonju edition emphasize, Chunhyang is kind of a noble. So it's kind of pretty much a different kind of approach to the Chunhyang, I think. These two translation by the Horace Allen and James Gale, they're pretty much based on the Gyeongpanbon, so we can see more the male-centered kind of narrative structure in the story. But when I just kind of read these two versions by the missionaries, I kind of noticed there are striking differences between them too. So we can talk about it later too.
Well, let's get into those striking differences. Let's start with the first of those two missionaries, Horace Allen's, and this is the beginning of, as you mentioned, this male-centric story. So who was Horace Allen? What was his version? And how does he change? Because there is dramatic differences between these two versions. His is just from your first eyesight. Horace Allen's is a very short text compared to Gale's, which we're going to get to in a second. So who was Horace Allen, and what was he trying to do, and what does his translation look like?
Yes, Horace Allen is one of the first missionary came into Korean Peninsula. He came in, but he came in as a kind of medical doctor because still the Joseon government has persecuted on the foreign the religion or foreign culture. So they have to kind of identify themselves. We're not interested in evangelization. We are more to help the people. So, but because he also had kind of this connection with the royal family of Joseon dynasty too. He actually helped the member of the royal family. So he, later on, he was appointed as a diplomat, kind of helped the Joseon government to become more like a legitimate, like a part of the world society. So he wanted to play as more like a political bridge between the Joseon Korea and America as well. So we can assume that he is a medical doctor, and also was a missionary. But looks like this motivation to translate the Chunhyang John came from his experience with his colleagues in Washington. They have no clue about the Korea. So looks like this Horace Allen wanted to inform his people or Americans or the Western the readers. There's a culture too, and to introduce this in Korean culture, he actually translated not only the Chunhyang, he also translated all other kind of folk tales or the famous popular story circulating in the 19th century or 20th century as well.
And sorry, carry on. I was just going to say that his focus here from this is. The male centricity of this really jumps out from the page as someone uninitiated like myself. So I'm going to quote a little bit here. When he, so at the beginning, the young man sees the young lady that he's interested in, and he starts like this. And I'm going to quote it. He says, superb. I can see her. I will have her sing and dance for me. And it's this sudden imposition of status, as in she's a woman, she is below me. And you write, which is really interesting here, that a lot of this comes from Horace Allen himself, who in other books, so in his book Things Korean, writes that Korean women, he says that Korean women are secluded from the outer world, and he has deep sympathy for them. So how much of this translation is him sympathizing with Korean women and having this image of them as downtrodden and secluded from the rest of society?
Yeah, it looks like the Horace Allen is the Chunhyang translation of Chunhyang by Horace Allen actually reflects his view about the Korean society as well, as you mentioned. So he actually characterized Korean society. Pretty much there is kind of a very clear distinction in terms of space or the roles between the man and woman. And he noticed it looks like a woman has been secluded in the private chamber. Well, in the original version, with both the Gyeongpan and Wampan, Chunhyang is actually on the swings outside, but the Horace Allen's version, Chunhyang is in her courtyard inside her house. So that kind of idea, like, oh, woman is kind of secluded, isolated in the private area or sphere, that kind of shape this kind of Horace Allen's approaches to this text as well. And also, he pretty much focused on the 이몽룡 rather than Chunhyang in this translated version, because usually the title is Chunhyangjeon, so we could assume that it's more about Chunhyang. But when you read the text by the Horace Allen, it's more about 이몽룡 as well. So how he struggled and how he wooed woman and how actually become more kind of like the inspector and came back to the Namon to rescue the people in this distressed, right? So this kind of idea is pretty much is pretty prominent in the text as well.
And from that as well, that there's that, as you mentioned it a little bit before, this element of that she is a singing girl or a public dancing girl. So for many people listening, they may not know what that means exactly, but that becomes important here because in this particular translation, she is consciously aware that it is a lower class profession. It's her status within society. And when she meets Yi, she begins to say things like, we can't marry because we're on different statuses of society. And as you write here, as soon as they do write a pledge of marriage, Yi goes into his father's office and removes Chunhyang's name from the registrar, as in, I've now made her, I've saved her from this lower class life in some ways.
Yeah, so I think this singing girl is coming from the Allen's translation of Kisang. So Kisang used to be as kind of entertainer in the pre-modern society, especially Chosŏn period, but they're actually pretty much trained in the music and the poems, and they actually, some of the Kisang, they actually could compose the poetry in lyric Chinese. So they're pretty much their elite in the society. But in terms of their social status, they belong to the lowborn. So this kind of contradiction, they're pretty much educated, but still belong to the lowborns, the lower class. Is kind of very sensitive issue, and that makes this Kisang the vulnerable as well. They can actually communicate, and they're patronized by the powerful male figures as well. But still, they're kind of sometimes they're treated as a singing girl. But here. Another very interesting aspect of the female entertainer here is the female entertainers belong to the lowborn, and the Chosŏn society actually have based on this two different type of lineage system. In case you're Yangban and your father is Yangban, your mother is Yangban, you could be automatically Yangban. But in case your mother is a slave or the lowborn, then you actually automatically kind of considered as lowborn. So Chunhyang's mother was Olme, her name, and she is a female entertainer serving the magistrate in Namon. So because Chunhyang's mother was a female entertainer, that makes the Chunhyang as a female entertainer too, or the lowborn class.
And when he leaves, so this is interesting. So he meets Chunhyang and he is eventually sent away. So they have this marriage compact, this secret marriage where they promise love to each other. It is very Romeo and Juliet, at least from my readings. And then he's sent away and he's separated from her. And again, the focus is entirely on him and not her, despite being the focus of the tale. So she's saying things like, when you go to Seoul, don't trifle, take your books, study hard. And so much of the focus is on him passing examinations, entering the civil service, and fulfilling this lifelong goal as a man.
Yes. So, I noticed as I mentioned before, it pretty much is kind of related to the original version, the Gyeongpan, that kind of structured upon the male view or male-centered the narrative. But still, the Horace Allen's version, they emphasize 이몽룡's role. 이몽룡 sometimes portrayed as kind of the juvenile, like to explore things and like the woman. But here in this version, the 이몽룡 is kind of pretty much considerate, and he became more mature type of the hero who actually eventually rescued the community. So, and also, looks like the story itself is kind of placed upon this love triangle between the Chunhyang and Keimyung. Then we have a third character, the pyŏng. He had kind of new magistrate. So people kind of simply imagine, oh, love triangle over there. But this story does not focus on the kind of rivalry, kind of relationship between Yi and Pyong. Or it's more like a binary. Yi is kind of more virtuous leader who eventually rescued the people in the Namon area, and Pyong is kind of evil kind of magistrate. He kind of committed a lot of corruption and he just bully people. So we see two different versions of males kind of competing in the story. So Chunhyang is in this as consequently, Chunhyang is not the major focus of the story. It's more like a Keimyung and how he deal with the people, how he approach people, and how they actually rescue the people.
And one of the interesting things, as you mentioned, a lot of ideas run through this is social justice and change and explicit moral lessons in some ways. And the lesson that you write, and it's clear here from Horace Allen's translation, that what we are meant to take away from the translation, at least from the character of Chunhyang, is that she's faithful. As in, she commits herself to marriage. The new magistrate comes in her, it falls in love with her, wants her to serve him, and she refuses. And so much of the story is about her being redeemed for being faithful and not betraying her husband. Again, almost a subservient role to her husband in all of this.
Yeah, so when we are reading the original version, like both Gyeongpan and Wonpan, the climax of the story is when Chunhyang is kind of beaten or tortured by the pyŏng. There, she's seeing a very nice, it's very emotional, like poem songs, 십장가. So every beating, she actually kind of defend herself, and also she kind of reveals all the problems the pyŏng or the corrupted officials have. So that songs or that poem songs, particular scene carries a lot of the political kind of more subversive ideas as well. But in the Horace Allen's version, when you look at the very conclusive part, the end of the story, that Chunhyang is kind of portrayed as, oh, she was a very virtuous woman. But it's also more about the Keimyung became very successful and good magistrate as well. So, so the message what the people can take away with the Allen's version is like, eventually, in case you're doing good, you can be rewarded. In case you're commit something wrong, then you will be punished. But still, the focus is more on Keimyung rather than the Chunhyang.
And there's a focus through a lot of Allen's translation, which is he must see the Confucianism around him as being the most fundamental part of the society, because despite the young man being completely besotted and lovesick and he can't sleep and he's sneaking away at night to see Chunhyang, he is always conscious to put in the translation that he's concerned about his father. He's listening to his father. He's checking on his father's health. Filial piety is huge in this. And when he goes to Seoul, he is such he's always fawning over the king and his father. And there's a real tale in this of the importance and the lasting importance of Confucianism, it seems.
Yeah, I think that's great questions. So the Chunhyang is more like a portrayed as she's kind of manifesting the faithfulness, as she's a faithful wife and 정절, 열녀, right? But at the same time, Yi also is portrayed as more like a paragon of the Confucian virtue as well. Looks like the text emphasized Yi as, is a very filial son. He actually chased after the woman, and sometimes it could be the troublemaker, but he eventually become very mature. But throughout the story, Yi was a very filial son. So I think that's another very interesting aspect of the story as well.
And one of the questions I was going to ask you is how do you see the character of the mother here in this translation? Because for me, she was a very interesting character in some ways. At the beginning, when the romance happens, she's very passive in some ways. She allows the young man to come into her house once they've committed themselves to marriage and all sorts of things. But as soon as they are separated and the young man has to disappear to Seoul, she spends all her time, even when her daughter is in prison, telling her about the mistakes that she has made and how she should move on and that she should give up on this young man. So how should we see the character of the mother in this story within this whole grand narrative that we've been speaking about?
Yeah, I think that's another very interesting question because, Chunhyang actually made into the cinematic versions as well. There's many films about Chunhyang, and when you watch this film, you can actually compare the role of Worme. So Worme sometimes play a role as a mediator. She really want to connect Mongyeong and Chunhyang. When Chunhyang is more reluctant to take the Mongyeong's offer, but sometimes she kind of she want to play more like a virtuous woman and the mother who does not want to kind of was more afraid about her daughter to be eventually abandoned like her because she was the female entertainer and she actually she had a Chunhyang daughter, but it looks like she was kind of abandoned by the magistrate as well. That kind of how this woman is playing around, depending on the version, I think that we can also see whole different a version of Royman as well.
So from this, let's step into the second translation, and this is James Gale. So again, who was James Gale? And you write interestingly that he takes a different approach to this translation. You write it resembles free translation, and this is a man who's focused on readability. So who was James Gale, and what in broad strokes does his translation look like, and how does it differ from the previous one?
James Gale is also the missionary came in Korea in the late 19th century. He was Canadian. He actually got the graduate from the University of Toronto, and he kind of decided to I want to become a missionary, and he arrived in the Korea in 1888, and he spent almost 40 years in Korea, but different from the Horace Allen, who actually served as a medical officer, the James Gale is more like a translator himself, because he translated a lot of materials, Korean materials, into English, and also he translated English materials, for example, John Bunyan's A Pilgrim's Progress into the Korean to kind of enlighten his Korean audience or readers with a biblical ideas as well. The Gale's translation is based on the different version from the Horace Allen's the source text. His version is based on the Lee Hae-jo's the 옥중하 as a flower in prison or jail. So this 옥중하 itself is kind of a more modern kind of version of Chunhyang. So we see the Lee Hae-jo actually recreated the Chunhyang as pretty much more the empowered woman in this text. And so the Gale's translation also reflect that kind of idea or ideas embedded in the source text. So Chunhyang here is much more the powerful, and she's very influential. And she's also very virtuous, not only as a kind of faithful wife, that the traditional the paragon type of woman. This is more like she's more kind of mature in her behavior and gestures or relationship with other characters.
That was a fascinating part of that for me reading this from the outside, because he, of course, is a Western missionary. I'm going to get to some of the elements of how Christianity has been pushed into some of these texts, but you write here, and this is important, that he desexualizes the character. There's these she is in some ways a very erotic figure, and she has this of course there's premarital sex involved, but he whitewashes this out of the text.
Yeah, I think that that's kind of very intentional intervention as a translator. So, well, this story itself, original story, was enjoyed by all different of classes. It kind of plays as Nangban because it carries, kind of conveys this message. Oh, the Confucian virtues very still matters in our everyday life. But at the same time, it's pretty much entertained by people because it has very strong elements of humor and satire as well. And this humor or entertaining moments is coming from the sexual scene between the Chunhyang and Mongyeong as well. But so that's kind of very important part of the story. But James Gale's version, he doesn't want to emphasize their relationship was not only emotional, their relationship is pretty much physical as well. So he actually provide very nuanced version. Looks like they spend night, but we can't be sure.
Yes. And the way he does portray the character, the female character, is she's a much more upstanding, incredible woman than the previous translation. So this is different to Horace Allen's in some ways, that she is not so worried about herself, but she is a completely upstanding moral figure. So even when she is going through hardships or when she's in prison, her only concern is that her mother is eaten well and things like this. And then these two floggers arrive at her door. There's a quote there, and she's worried about them and how tired they are. And it seems to be an imputation here that through her concern for everybody around her, not just her husband, she is showing herself to be that virtuous woman who stands above her potential lower class.
Yeah. So, well, Chunhyang is sometimes portrayed as more a carefree woman who kind of sometimes she can be prickly and capricious. But in this version, why notice? This scene as also carried this code of the satire as well, because the floggers knocked the door and wanted to arrest Chunhyang at the very moment. In the Korean version, the floggers were kind of embarrassed by their kind of because of the Wolme and Chunhyang, their attitude has been completely changed. So they looks like they did not treat the floggers well, but all of a sudden they wanted to bribe the floggers. They wanted to treat the wines to them and to be nice to them. So the floggers, their reaction was, "Oh, there's something that we don't see coming," but the chaos version is we don't see any kind of the sense of the satire here. The floggers were deeply touched by the very nice hospitality provided by Chunhyang's mother and Chunhyang. And when they actually came back to the court and made a report to the magistrate, oh, actually they're just poor women, and we pretty much they actually fulfill our kind of hungry souls. So in this moment, we can see that James Gale's version want to recreate the Chunhyang as more like a Virgin Mary character. She's kind of all virtuous all around. She is a very filial daughter. At the same time, she is very kind to the people, and she's a very thoughtful character as well. So that's another very different elements I find in Gale's translation.
So there's a question that I had reading both translations throughout the week, and that was this question of marriage. And you put this in there as well, especially in this recent one by Gale, is that it's marriage is a private, personal affair in some ways. It seems to be these two young, this young man and this young woman. It's enough for them to promise their commitment to each other. So, how common is that as an idea? Is this just because they are subversively sneaking away to get married that this is the way they do it, or is this common in some ways? This personal, private nature of the marriage, and would such a personal, private marriage be official in some ways?
Yeah, that's another very intriguing question. I can have the 1 hour lecture about it. About the marriage. So people usually imagine a pre-modern Korea, the marriage is pretty much regulated by the parents. because still we see when you look into the contemporary Korea, the arranged marriage, 중매결혼, is pretty much popular still now, right? So people have this idea marriage is not something like we can choose by our own will. It's much more arranged by the parents, and the both family have to agree with it. So also the Korean drama, they actually still portrays the conflicts between this marriage. Because the parents does not approve their marriage and that the young couple is struggling about it. But when you go back to the pre-modern Korea, so it looks like they have this kind of idea, and actually coming from the Confucian, the classics, you have to seek or the matchmaker who actually bridge the two family. And after that, you have a 6 steps, 용예. After 6 steps, and finally you can engage with someone else and you can get married. But when you look into many fiction or the romance in the pre-modern, especially Chosŏn Korea, looks like that this Confucian norms about the marriage or the man and woman relationship pretty much is kind of strict, and that's very considered important. But the story actually portrays the man and woman. They kind of just falling in love, and especially not only just kind of physical attraction. It's more like they exchange a lot of poems, and they know each other by telling by the poems. What kind of person or personality this man or woman has. So we see a lot of the midnight rendezvous in the story. So I think. Well, our ideas, they pretty much the chosen period. The woman they're not allowed to meet each other physically in open places. So their marriage life or the kind of courtship has been pretty much forbidden. That might be true, but I think when it comes to like other classes, especially the lower classes or commoners, I think they enjoy much more freedom. And also we have many records in history that some woman actually remarry a man 3 times or 4 times, and or have a kind of the relationship with the monk. So there's a lot of different types of stories as well. On the one hand, there has been very much a strict idea about marriage and courtship, but people actually always kind of, they find a way to evade the laws. So, yeah.
Yes. So let's step into that question that we mentioned briefly there about the missionary Christian element in here. And this is really interesting. So you've, through your translation, you look at how Gale has run this translation and slipped in a lot of Christian epistemology. So there's this moment when Chunhyang is in prison and she dreams of drifting down this Chinese river. And Gale takes this moment and imposes a number of Christian elements. So he talks about the spirit traveling. He talks about the flesh of the moment. He talks about being met by angels and things like this. So how much has he pushed Christianity into this? Because, of course, you also mentioned later that there's this concept, Hongbaek, and he takes this, and there's these 2 principles, Hung and Yang, and he forces them together and makes them just one principle, spirit. And it seems to be a very conscious effort by Gale to change this away from the society it is and into Christian words and Christian context.
Yeah, so when I first read this Chunhyang in my graduate course, and I noticed it's kind of, this text is pretty much heavy with the Chinese allusions, because you don't have any Chinese knowledge in the Chinese classical literature. Sometimes some points is kind of interpretable. But so also is, in case you do understand the context or the allusions, it's sometimes not easy to translate it properly. So here in my quote here is the Chunhyang is kind of in her dream. She encountered the legendary figure in the Chinese legends like Yi Huang and Nu Yang or A Huang Yoyong. And these 2 women is from their kind of the wives or the concubine of King Miao. Based on that, the Chunhyang is that kind of. So we can see that in this quote, the pretty much the passage is kind of carry the high symbolism of the classics or Chinese the context. But when you look at the Gale's descriptions, he actually does not translate. She does not take a very literal translation of it. It's more like he kind of put that as kind of Chunhyang's spirits and carried it away. And it's kind of, she doesn't mention like what exactly happened or how she kind of encounter the transcendental, the figures or Ahang and Yoyong. Also, when you look at this text, or especially the chapter titles, the original version does not have divided into several chapters. It kind of the whole entire text is kind of just provided as one single text. Of course, when in the pansori version, it's not divided. Sometimes it's divided because we don't see that many pansori the singers singing the Chunhyang Jeon. Like they actually does not give the whole story at once because it takes about 8 or 9 hours to complete the story. But when you look at this Gale's translation, he actually divides the Chunhyang into many sections, 25 or 24. And each section, he actually put the name, small headings. So when you look at the headings, some like titles kind of reminds of like more the Christian worldview because, for example, there is judgment in the 23rd chapter, and also the laurel wreath. That kind of symbolism is actually pretty much affected by the Christian ideas as well. So I think Gale wanted to inform his reader, or he wanted to combine this kind of Christian ideas with the Korean, the traditional text. But at the same time, he actually wanted to recreate the Chunhyang as kind of not only the traditional, the faithful life, she was also could be elevated to some kind of sacred, the woman as well.
And in doing that, there's this really interesting way that he changes his description of Yi, the young man. So he puts a different kind of focus on him. He doesn't put the same positive focus that Alan does. And you write here, he is often described as inconsiderate and frivolous. And this is an important moment when he goes back to Namhong to rescue his wife. And he can't help on the way stopping and flirting with a young woman. And it's a very different description of our young man involved. And you write at the bottom here that some of this has to do with the fact that he has this theory of men and women are all equal before God. And he is trying to raise up the female character in some ways and bring down the male character.
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So we see more like Chunhyang, the empowered version of Chunhyang in Gale's translation. But at the same time, when we compare it to Horace Allen's version, Lee Mong-yong is such a filial, virtuous man or hero or a leader of the society. But in this version, Gale's version, Mong-yong is still kind of juvenile, right? He wants to flirt with women, although he passed the examination and kind of reaches his adulthood because he's 16 years old. But yeah, so, it's kind of like different point, but people usually regard it during the Joseon period. They actually have this kind of capping ceremony about the time when they reach the 15, both man and woman in the Yangban household. So it looks like but they're 16 years old, both Mong-yong and Chunhyang, which kind of consider, they're juvenile, they're just this kind of children, they're playing around. But when you look into more like a historical context, the story is kind of straight in. They're pretty much regarded as kind of adults because they actually went through all this capping ceremony and became 16 years old. But still, in Gale's translation, Mong-yong is more like a childlike man, right? or he kind of like to flirt, and it's not like a mature kind of impeccable the manhood we can see in the original version. It's quite different.
So let's take a step back and look at the both in context here. And one of the context here, of course, you're right, it's Orientalism and domestication. We have to look at some of this through. So let's look at how these stories were taken and changed and incorporated by people. So we do have to talk about the Japanese colonial period, and this is a period, of course, in the early 1930s and earlier, and reaching up until the end of the Second World War. And during this time, this tale becomes very popular. There's a version in theaters here that you talk about, and there's the performance here. And you write that the Japanese use this and they take it, and it's almost for them an effective means of promoting Japanese assimilation in some way. So how did the Japanese take this tale and begin to use it as a means of assimilating the two cultures?
Yeah, so this kind of topic, how the Chunhyang was accepted by Japanese audience, or how kind of they kind of translated or adapted it, was kind of done by multiple scholars now. But when I just recap the arguments, actually Chunhyang was kind of consumed as kind of the pansori version. There's kind of singers in the corner of the market, and they actually play or perform the repertoire from the Chunhyang. But when it comes to when the Japanese and especially the Korean writer, they adapted the story into in the Japanese the play, they actually staged this Chunhyang, and the reaction about this kind of a Chunhyang as a kind of theoretical form is quite also very intriguing as well, because Japanese audience, they kind of enjoy the Chunhyang as kind of it's more like they're bringing kind of homesickness, like kind of nostalgia about their past. But so it's kind of very exotic elements in it. So they actually kind of project more kind of Orientalistic view of the Chunhyang. But the Korean audience, after seeing this the play in the theater, and they was pretty much mad about it, because they actually claimed that, oh, this is nothing about Chunhyang. It's they actually made a completely different version to kind of please themselves. So that kind of reaction, we see kind of this struggle between the nationalist sentiments and also like colonize the power, the colonial authority to play around this kind of area of arts and performance as well.
So let's step into the Orientalism of the two translators that we mentioned there. So they've made a very conscious effort here to change the story in some ways. And importantly, both of them were changing language and context and just tweaking things and colloquialisms so that a foreign audience would appreciate this a lot more. And so I might get to open up that idea of what these two translators were doing. And of course, you write here, and this is important, that this translation, that what they did, in some ways removes the emotions or the behaviors, and it reinvents them for a completely different audience.
Yeah. So, I say they actually translated the original version or edition of the Chunhyang, but it looks like especially the Allen's version is much more like recreation of the Chunhyang. And also looks like this, especially Horace Allen, he enjoyed a lot of freedom, like changing the original text as well, because when the Japanese version of Chunhyang was played or performed, and many people actually know what Chunhyang is, and they can actually complain about it or they can criticize about it. But the Horace Allen, he was kind of from frontier. He just kind of first man who would translate the Korean material. So he actually have a lot of freedom in as a translator. But Gale is much more. He actually translated a lot of materials, and also he was engaged in the translation projects of the Bible as well. So Gale was much more meticulous in translation. So, but well, we can see some part of the translation. We can see more literal type of translation, more technical translation, but we see a lot of the part, the Gale, to reinterpret the context and try to see the characters not only just victim of the feudal system, they have a potential to be transformed into some characters with agency and power. And so that's one of the reasons why the Gale wanted to focus on the Chunhyang character. And Chunhyang is not only just a faithful wife, she's more like a kind of like a figure with a lot of potential to be transformed, and she can change the society, and also she can be a more Christianized woman as well.
And so we're talking about Gale, and you're right, this is interesting here, that we have to look at Gale in the context and what he was witnessing around him. And he was witnessing the decline of the Chosŏn dynasty. So this is the Chosŏn dynasty tale, and he's witnessing the decline of the dynasty all around him with the annexation by Japan. And you're right that he in some ways feels responsible for accurately preserving Korea's literary tradition. And we have to look at his translation in some ways as a man who recognizes that the culture of Korea is in some ways around him disappearing before his eyes.
Yeah. So, well, many people working on the Gale, they kind of argue that Gale was not pretty much interested in like a political intervention as a missionary, because it's kind of very crucial point in the period. Like Korea was annexed by Japan, and so the governance or the sovereignty is completely changed. But Gale actually does not want it to involve in this political things. But when you look at his translation, we see kind of Gale's translation itself has been changed over time. So in this version, it came out after the colonization of Korea. And he actually I can see his more a sympathy towards the people, the Korean people, and especially the woman. So it's not only they want to kind of, he wanted to actually, of course, his kind of target audience is kind of Western settlers in the capital who actually read the magazine, and because the story was serialized in the magazine. But he also wanted to imbue this idea of the Korean people, although they're under kind of the colonial rule, we can still they're still very important members of the society, and we can actually empower them. Or they still have they have their own culture, right? So I think you see more defensive kind of type approach in this text as well.
Now, before we do finish here, there is one important question that runs through a lot of this. And you write as well here that there's a certain subversive message in these translations, in both of these translations, that seems to run through. So the new magistrate that arrives, he is obviously corrupt. He's described as being corrupt. His rule is tyrannical in many ways. There's this constant talk about classes and class structure, but there's this imputation through all of this of people trying to free themselves from the social status of the society. This look at the ruling classes as being potentially corrupt, and the idea that Chunhyang's lowborn status is never going to be a serious barrier to her in her life and her pursuit of love. So how subversive were these two texts? I'm wondering how were they taken at the time, and how subversive should we read them today?
Yeah. So actually, the story has very many different type of layers of interpretation, and depending on what you want to focus on, either you want to focus on Keimyung or you want to focus on Chunhyang, you can actually that kind of yield a different type of interpretation. But basically, I think I still kind of raise this question to myself: why the story is still popular? Because the story still isn't made into until the 2000. The story actually produced a lot of the films, and that means people actually enjoy the story. So one of the reason the story they explain this popularity of the story would be it has kind of very substantial the political message as well. We see more like liberating message as well in this text, as you mentioned. So it's not only just like a kind of the characters struggle a lot, and their kind of struggle is paid back, and they were rewarded. It looks like they have a very simple structure, but when you look at the story, when the kind of Chunhyang kind of speak for the people and like expose the Pyeongakdo's kind of corruption, and the moment or after that, now Imongryos came in and kind of rescue the whole the community and also the Chunhyang, that gives kind of liberating the moments to the readers and audience. So I think that that's one of the attractions of the story.
So as a final question, and you touched on it a little bit there, this tale has survived an awful long time. A lot of stories come and they go and they don't stick within cultures and the literary tradition, but also their national identity in so many ways. So how should we view the tale today, considering how long it has survived? As you mentioned, it's still there within movies and TV shows and literature. It's still being reproduced. So how should we, after all these years, and look back on this tale and its importance in the Korean literary tradition?
Yeah, when you look at especially the films about the Chunhyang, we see all different type of the characterization there too. When it comes to the 70s, we see the Chunhyang is more like carefree, and she likes to go out and as sports, doing sports, and that kind of carefree character. But also in 70s and 80s, that the Chunhyang character is more like she is the model of this feminist movement as well. So she actually does not kind of like coerced by this old rule or traditional cultural norms. She actually wants to break the boundaries. So also when it comes to like a 2000 version by Ingontek, Chunhyang Dion, so we see this Chunhyang is kind of she carries more exotic, or she kind of attracts more exotic eyes upon her. So the director wanted to project the Chunhyang, not only who the woman who has an agency or voice. Chunhyang is pretty much muted, and also she's kind of more like portrayed as kind of the objects that of the pretty much the Western Orientalism. So the 2000 version, they actually wanted to kind of self-orientation, Orientalism, I think. They want to portray the Korean culture as something very exotic, and they are by kind of reflecting or adopting the Western's eyes about the Korean culture. So depending on the version, or also the version actually reflected the kind of a social climate and ambience. I think this kind of text or theme has been changed over time, pretty much.
So that's a wonderful, thoughtful note to end the podcast on. So the Janet's translation and editing and analysis of the work of the two missionaries, James Gale and Horace Allen, is called The Tale of Chunhyang, as translated by Western Missionaries. And of course, I'm going to link it below. There's a lot in it that we didn't get to today, so I do encourage listeners to go and read it for themselves. And I'm also going to link below the two translations in question by Horace Allen, by James Gale and Horace Allen. Both are available online, both free to read without charge. So I encourage you to read them in conjunction. It really is a fascinating read. And I really enjoyed myself speaking to you, Janet. Thanks for coming on the Koreana podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I had such a pleasant time too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Koreana podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.